Hi, welcome to our play posit on observation. Our group includes myself, Nicholas, Maida, and Charisse. Our group read this book called Observation Techniques, Structured to Unstructured by Bill Gillham. We want to begin our presentation by having you wonder about a few events and how they tie into observation. Have you ever been able to remember everything you ate 3 weeks ago? Unless you have hyperthymesia, you probably can't remember those individual things. Maybe you've sat people watched and seen a person with a dog, but could you remember what kind of shoes they were wearing the next day? Maybe your doctors ask you to take measurements of your heart rate or your blood pressure, and just think about the power of that data that they can use to help you in your health. And maybe an example from our more professional lives. Have we ever collected evidence from a classroom visit? Instead of just talking to the teacher about how did that really go, or how do you think the students really got that concept during that, you can just think about the data that comes from observations, direct observations, and collecting that data and using that in our research. So just to begin an overview of what observation is, it's to see what people actually do instead of what they just claim to do or how they felt when they were doing it. It can illuminate a lot of actions that we're just not aware of consciously. This is all an attempt to shift the subjective reality to a more objective and valid measure. Observation allows us to monitor different events over specified periods of time and then quantify them. But we've got to be intentional and planned and have a focus. What's really powerful is when we combine different methods of research with observation, and that can give us really deeper insights to what's going on. Again, it's really about what we say or what we think happened versus what actually happened. We're going to pause here for knowledge check 1. There's several different types or flavors of observation. The first one we're going to review with you is called structured observation. Its characteristics include a very highly specific focus. You have to really know exactly what you are observing. We always have this dichotomy of an observer and a non-participant, the person who's being observed. And this is really useful when self-knowledge may not be available, or it might be compromised by some kind of bias or inability to articulate what has happened. Some of the aspects is the data is usually quantified. The focus needs to be very specific and defined, and then we can summarize the data at the end and do some analysis on it. This is very different from others because it has these aspects, but it does have limitations. We don't always capture the full social context of where the observation is occurring. And if we discover something interesting or different that we didn't expect, a highly structured observation may not capture that information. And again, why don't we just ask the people? Well, we're not always self-aware. We're not always able to tell you exactly what happened at that moment of time when we're thinking back to it. And our memories and our thoughts can change those ideas. There's lots of elements of structured observation. We really have to start with looking without any focus first to see what's going on. What are the patterns? What are the flows? Then we have to start to define what are the events I can count. We have to make a nice table to collect the information. But the power lies in that we can link events, like what happens first that led to the thing that happened second. How long did it take for a student to enter the room before they started answering very rigorous questions from the teacher? We have to worry about time. How long should I do this? Or how often should I do my tally marks? And also we need to think about the sampling. How many people are we going to sample to get a good picture of what's going on? A great example of this comes from the author Bill Gillham. He did a study of homeless people who begged for money on the streets of Glasgow. And this is one individual he befriended. And it took him a few weeks or months to get to know this person and realize he was going to be the focus of his structured observation. But there's a lot of different parts he had to do before he got to this nice little table with numbers. He needed to decide where to sample. He needed to think about who his subject was, and that was this gentleman. You need to think about the time of sampling, but this only came after he sat there on the streets of Glasgow a few times and noticed when people donated to street beggars and when they didn't. And he thought an hour of time right in the middle of the day, right after lunch, was a great time to take this data. He also became interested in who was donating. Were they male? Were they female? Were they under the age of 45 or over the age of 45? And finally, he had to think about what types of events were happening. Maybe it was someone just silently dropping money in a cup without even looking at Ian. Maybe it was someone who gave some money but wanted to talk to Ian, maybe about his dog or his life. And then sometimes there's people who just talked to Ian and didn't give any money at all. And now we're going to pause for knowledge check 2.
The second type of observation is semi-structured observation. So characteristics of semi-structured observation. There's actually questions. So questions are planned specifically in advance, but are also open. The purpose of having open questions is to deter predicting possible outcomes. This also includes asking questions as one goes along, but it is important to remember that the primary method of collecting this data is still by watching. And this method is utilized to determine practical problems people experience on a regular basis and find ways to address those problems. So, how do you go about constructing questions that are open-ended and help them supplement you with your observation? So here's a checklist that's provided in our test of things that you can take into mind when creating questions that are open-ended. Again, the whole idea of having these open-ended questions is to support your observation, but not necessarily lead into an outcome that you already predict on your own. So let's take a look at an example of semi-structured observation applied in a real-world context. So, according to Gillham, there was a study of the older population, specifically the older population and their difficulties to maintain an independent, healthy, and rewarding lifestyle. As they get older, things that were routine and normal for them to do without ease has now become difficult. So, as a result of this semi-structured observation, and in this specific study, this whole idea of inclusive design has come up. How can we go ahead and create things that are going to solve problems, specifically for this older generation being able to go along in their everyday life with ease? You might have heard of the term ergonomics. Ergonomical products being provided to people to allow them to still do their job and carry about their day. A few examples: the Ford Focus, a car that you might be familiar with or have seen on your drives down the street to and from work, came out as a result of a study of older people being able to mobile and still get around. Also, chairs providing back support and people being able to still perform their job. And lastly, the keyboard, a way for people to position their wrists and still do whatever job and work that they have to do with ease. So in context, semi-structured is looked at through the lens of ecological psychology. Ecological psychology is the interaction of people and their environment and its impact of psychology on an individual. So, an individual's behavior may change depending on the environment they're in. For example, there are some environments that may have a positive impact on an individual, meaning they're being able to flourish and do whatever they need to do in that environment. Or on the other hand, a negative impact in which an individual is constrained by the environment that they are interacting in. So let's go back to the example of the keyboard and this whole idea of asking open-ended questions. So we might have a question, which is, how do you feel about using this keyboard? Which is probably going to give more of a question of feeling predictable outcomes that we know they might respond, versus how has this keyboard helped you? It's going to give a more elaborate response, and we don't know necessarily what the person is going to say. Limitations of observing problems of the living. So in this case study, there's issues. One concern is that people are accepting their problems as normal and just a part of their life, and they've learned to deal with it. Another part is people not realizing that they have difficulty living and can get help. But because they've already adapted to this lifestyle when they didn't necessarily have to, they just come to the realization that it's a part of their life and they have to deal with it. And this is going to bring us to knowledge check number 3.
Observation type 3 is the unstructured observation. Characteristics are full participant observation, cultural immersion by the participant observer, which allows the observer to form relationships with what are called sponsors and key informants to gain and strengthen relationships with those in a given community. Some examples where we see this type of style are ethnographies and self-observations. Now, the unstructured observation style differs from other methods as a result of its focused, as well as being a full immersed participant observer, and entering into the project with a lack of prior theoretical commitment, really allowing the data collected from day-to-day life to inform the direction the study will take. Some limitations of unstructured observation include a high risk of bias entering the data, meaning that as the data is being collected through notebooks or however the participant observer chooses to, there is a possibility that some subjectivity will enter into the collection and interpretation of data. The representation sample is generally also very small. And finally, it can take a lot of time to gather factual data using participant observation. A prime example of unstructured observation is William Foote White's Street Corner Society. A brief overview of the study is that the study took place in the slum area of Boston, specifically working with an Italian community in 1938, and the study concluded in 1941. The purpose of White's study was to understand gang culture and its social structure. So the research approach, again being participant observer, resulted in White moving his entire family and living within this community so that he could develop strong relationships and ties with those in this area of Boston. White's study was a significant professional contribution to the field. It served as a strong example of participant observation, and at the time it received little attention, but when it was republished in 1955, it garnered critical praise and became a bestseller and a standard college text. However, not all of the reviews have been positive. It wasn't popular in certain communities, and White's description of the neighborhood as a slum has been called into question. Now it's time for knowledge check 4. Another way that we see unstructured observation come to life is through self-observation. The purpose of self-observation is to access a person's inner thoughts and mental events, and it allows a window into the creative process. So we will see a lot of creatives use this type of style to better understand their own process and then share that thinking and knowledge with the greater community so the entire community could benefit from the findings of the self-observation. The process is usually broken up into 4 steps where evidence is gathered, a lot of times through journal writing. The journal writings are observed and documented and reviewed. And finally, an edited account is produced to share with the greater community. Some ethical dilemmas that we encounter with unstructured observation is personal data, ensuring that we continue to regulate and control the data that we collect in this type of study. Consent, ensuring that there's always informed consent in this type of study. Covert and overt observation, which looks like avoiding collecting data in a way that isn't explicit with subjects in a study. Sometimes we will see investigative journalists enter into covert observation. Additionally, observation ownership and interpretation, meaning that the ethnographer is constantly interpreting and selecting and constructing the reality presented in the data, which can allow, again, subjectivity to enter into that interpretation of the information collected in an ethnographic study. And finally, intrusive questioning. So ensuring that the priority is very obvious and upfront with subjects in completing the study. And so determining whether it is important to ask a question and potentially violate the privacy or the relationship with a subject. The limits of this observation style are the evolution of behavior, complementary research, other complementary research methods are needed, and also the contribution of observation to theory. So in totality, when we look at the evolution of behavior, a brief observation does not always paint the picture of what is really going on in a community. Complementary research methods needed, meaning that observation cannot tell the whole story. We need other methods to make sense of what we see in day-to-day life in these studies. And finally, looking at the contribution of observation to theory, ethnographic studies do not usually adopt a theoretical perspective, as has been discussed, because of the strong emphasis on description and explicit attempt to not impose a specific theory on what is being observed, but also to interpret the event. Knowledge check number 5.
So what is observation and its importance to research? So observation as a research method has made a number of contributions. Number 1, the notion of understanding. The notion of understanding is important because in order to address or come up with solutions to a problem, we need to understand and figure out what the problem actually is. Also, this term perspective explanations or theories, 3 in particular. Grounded theory, which is explanation derived from discovered evidence. Substantive theory, explanation of what was found as a result of observation. And formal theory, more extensive than substantive theory and stretches beyond the confines of academia. So we could talk about observation in relation to social action and social attitudes. So observation serves as a tool for findings for a specific purpose, a specific study, but findings do not necessarily stay in its original purpose, but ultimately make contributions on a larger scale. So in closing, observation observes what people actually do, not what they think they do. Observation is done over a period of time, and observation can impact changes in a specific study and beyond. Thank you so much for listening to our Play Pause It presentation. We hope that you enjoyed learning about observation.